Welcome, everybody. We're going to get started, so please take a seat. I still see some seats in the front row and off to the sides and in the middle, so please come in and take a seat. Welcome to Spring Quarter Anthropocene Lecture Series. We have a really amazing, thank you, applaud. Please clap. To quote, okay. We have a great lineup this quarter. We're starting off with Alejandro de Acosta and Sarah Williams to kind of help set Donna Haraway's work in our minds. Before we do that, I want to thank again the media services staff and interns, Ben Hargett, Raoul Berman, and all the interns and student workers who help set up this great work around the fact that we don't have a big lecture hall yet. Maybe next year we'll have one. We do have people in the experimental theater as well as in the recital hall. There's a two-way video feed and audio feed between the two spaces. When you are, I don't see it, oh, I do see it over there. When you want to ask a question and during the Q&A period at the end, please make sure that you're at a microphone. There's a microphone over here in the recital hall. Thank you for the light, on the aisle. And in the experimental theater, there's one up at front. You will be on video. The video will be edited. It will be made available via YouTube without search terms. So it's still a private video, but just so you know that your image may be captured on video. Please stay in your seats until the end. It's really disruptive for people to get up and leave in the middle, especially in the ET where the risers make a lot of noise. Okay, thank you very much, and enjoy.
Full fathom 5 thy father lies, of his bones are coral made. Those are pearls that were his eyes. Nothing of him that doth fade, but suffer a sea change into something rich and strange. Sea nymphs hourly ring his knell. Ding dong.
Ding dong, ding dong. It's a sea change in mind, in nature, we're interested in talking about Donna Haraway's work today.
When we left off, Andrew Culp was talking to us, left us with 3 figures at the end of his presentation in the winter. We had Gaia, although Gaia immediately begins to multiply. There's Lovelock's Gaia, the self-regulating organism. There's the Gaia of the philosopher Isabel Stengers, the Gaia that intrudes. And there are more and more. Look up the conference that happened in Brazil, the 1,000 Names of Gaia, with European, Latin American, indigenous scholars all discussing the different conceptions of Gaia. Culp's second figure was Prometheus, the figure of the tremendous capacity to affect and change worlds and technology, not just geoengineering, but also designing and engineering our own bodies. And the third, perhaps the most troubling of Culp's, Medea, following from Peter Ward's idea that multicellular life is suicidal, that Earth could be a mother that kills her children. These figures could go on proliferating, and even if I turn, I already see a fourth, a tentacular figure appearing beside me. Yeah. What should we call this fourth figure? Medusa?
Medusa? Should I say more about those two?
No, I think you should.
I think so, I should. So this is an interactive presentation, obviously, and although it's called the Anthropocene, Donna Haraway has been quite averse to that term. She has proposed Capitalocene, and she has proposed Plantatiocene, and she's proposed the Holocene, which I think is what she will be talking about week 3. This figure is a complicated figure. The images you're seeing now are from one of her talks. We see Medusa on the left. It's also a Medusa as Melissa. These figures change through history, the queen of the bees. Juxtaposed on the right, you see a figure that is both terrifying and beautiful for some of us, an octopus, a tentacular face. The tentacular, if we take it apart etymologically, we end up with palm, that which touches. I'm arguing that that is a lot of what Donna Haraway's work is about. So, a little bit more about her before I launch into my thing. She's networked an entire field called Feminist Studies of Science and Technology. And the key to this field is, remember the ding-dong? Mind is in and out of nature, and nature is in and out of mind. Science, social science, cultural studies, but also art, visual and literary, must be invoked. Donna has crafted language like nature's cultures and cyborgs for earthly survival. And we're about to experience some of her arsenal, or some would call an artist's toolkit, for embodying and re-embodying what it means to be human and, or, plus, other on a blasted planet. And that I'd like to thank Miranda's the one that I think suggested that term for this planet in some text. There's a whole group of people that were involved in making this happen and making Donna happen. She's here as the Evans Scholar. So many programs, including ours, will be participating with her week 3. And my thrill and my mask, if you will call it that, is that Donna was my dissertation advisor. And I know that she loves art. I know that she loves the other. She's written about companion species. So as this presentation unfolds, you'll learn that this mask was created by students in the program, Aurora, who are sitting in the room, Aurora and Connor. And we have gooey duck skins in the front of your face because it's a mask covered in gooey duck skins. And gooey duck skins come from our mascot. It's a mask that's intended to look a bit Medusa-like, a bit Cthulhu-like. So if we move to those images and take a look at these, you've noticed a fatal flaw. I cannot see. It's very humbling. So we see here 2 thinking figures, and Donna often works through thinking figures. Thinking from an evolutionary point of view, a neuroscience point of view, is the internalization of movement. So what does it mean to think? And we always think with and through media. The gooey duck. The thinking figure that Lovecraft himself created. This is his Cthulhu figure. The tentacular mouth, the face that thinks, the face that touches, bringing back this notion that you'll see later that thinking is in fact a form of touch, an internalization of movement. So a question for you. What does it mean to think through and with a gooey duck? I would just love some ideas thrown out. To have a gooey duck as our mascot, what did the founding fathers, and yes, they were fathers, what might they have had in mind and body? Anyone? Phallus. I think they had that in body, not in mind, but nevertheless. Resiliency. Digging deep. Sticking your neck out. Humility. Spitting when necessary. I like that one. There's actually a bit of footage from the first faculty retreat in which Al Wiedemann proposed the gooey duck. And these were some of the words. And it's included in a video called 3 Feet Under. The gooey duck was intended to be distinct, independent, adaptable, ugly as hell, lucrative, and I've given us in parentheses, I don't think Al had any idea that when I would be giving this talk about him, that the gooey duck industry in Washington State is now 22 million, and as of yesterday, a gooey duck at Taylor Shellfish sells for $35 to $40 per gooey duck, and that is shipping overseas. Number one market for Washington State gooey ducks is in Asia. Vulnerable and non-aggressive. Evergreen was founded about a whole series of no's, one of which was no football team, no competition. Non-aggressive, no grades. And we turned it into Latin to be proper, omnia nextaris, let it all hang out. It doesn't move. And many of us sitting in front of computer screens can think our fastest when the body doesn't move. This is a very, very strange state for thinking when you realize from an evolutionary point of view that thinking in fact was adaptive in order to move more effectively. To think whether that tiger will eat me or whether it won't was an evolutionary advantage. So, my quick and dirty for you to maybe have some tools when Donna arrives. She talks fast, she thinks fast. She invents words as she speaks. Harroway is to the tentacular as thinking is to touch. And I'm evoking a Greek word from Aristotle's word, synesthesia, or thesis. We have a modern version of it, synesthesia, and if you go into surgery, you have, very good. A trick for listening to Donna and the multiple levels that she moves through. What if perception is nothing but or other than scaled sensation? Put differently, what would it mean for touch to be the root of thinking, and for thinking, in turn, to be in its most elevated form a kind of touch? This is Daniel Heller-Rosen, a contemporary commentary on Aristotle's work. Now, lest you think this is theory, which it is. Theory is making visible the invisible. Here's human origins made visible. My face, the tentacular, the hagfish, the proto-human, proto-mammalian. We have a tentacular face, the sucker mouth. We have the eel-like, snake-like body. We have Medusa as our own evolutionary past. Our very movement encompasses this creature. Out of this creature, the head evolved. This head, the head that Donna's so fond of, her current, mostly, maybe, contemporary, most favorite thinking figure, is the day octopus. And the day octopus can do amazing things. I'm guessing she might talk about it. She operates under SF. And here's what SF can stand for. String figures, science fact, science fiction, speculative fabulation, speculative feminism, and so far. Things are that tenuous at this moment in time, so far. Some of Harroway's methodological indicators. She's low tolerance for human exceptionalism, thus my appearance as a perhaps not only human creature. My appearance perhaps as something that brings forward the evolutionary mammalian, reptilian, let's keep going, history that a tentacular face makes apparent, makes visible. One way of doing theory is to make visible the invisible. Another indicator for her, methodological individualism. She's much more in favor of something she calls obligate symbiosis. Her argument is that multicellularism, and if you're familiar with Lynn Margulis's work, this really radical change that happened in the field of biology when we started looking at the micro, complexity resulted from indigestion. Something ate something else. Bacteria, infection. Indigestion is the origin of complexity in Donna's worldview. To be one is to be many. And I ask anyone in the audience, how many creatures are alive on our body at any given moment? An inch of skin, how many thousands of creatures are existing? and our guts that don't operate unless how many hundreds and thousands of creatures are inhabiting us. My favorite from the terroir program this year, students did a tasting with oysters. What if reading and thinking, listening, what we're doing with each other right now, is like eating a raw oyster? It tastes us as we taste it. A figure I really loved. Do we have Doctor Who fans in the audience? Thank you. It's still the most popular British television show. This is an ood, and an ood is a tentacular face, thinking and feeling in the tentacular, in the touch, in the palm. It carries its hind brain with it. This is an ostrich egg. I studied people who wear 20 to 40 pounds of ostrich egg necklaces in beads around their neck. They craft them. Explanation: the first thermos, the object that allowed humans to move into desert-like environments. The hindbrain, in the Doctor Who version of it, by carrying your brain on the outside, you can share it with people. And I'm soon at the point where I'd like to share my thinking and the thinking of Alejandro with the audience. Again, the octopus and Scott Gilbert's work, which is Donna is very fond of. We are all lichens now. And lest again you think I'm thinking in theory. These creatures are present. We are it, it is us. Alejandro, think we must. It matters what stories tell stories. This is Donna borrowing from Virginia Woolf. Donna and Virginia Woolf borrowing from Ursula Le Guin. Ursula Le Guin borrowing back and forth. You read Ursula Le Guin's short stories. It matters what stories tell stories. It matters what thoughts think thoughts. It matters what worlds worlds.
Let's show the video.
Oh my gosh, you're gonna put me on the spot. Okay, we do escape.
We have a selection, an excerpt from a recent talk by Donna Haraway last year, I think, talking about the figure of the Medusa. And then we're going to go way back in time to some excerpts from a video she did with Paper Tiger TV in the 80s.
Okay, and we have Julie Russo and perhaps Naima here as well. Paper Tiger Television. You're going to see me again because during graduate school, the intense pleasure of mixing media, moving from the classroom into the performance space was what Donna was about. A group of us as graduate students created the second video that you're going to see. And it was shown both in, I think it was New York and San Francisco at the time, by Paper Tiger Television, an activist group that said, let's not passively receive images or artwork. Let's be creators of the images that we see, of the media we see and listen to. So from a recent talk.
Command tab.
Excuse me?
Command tab, I think, to get to the QuickTime.
Or here.
Okay.
Past investments, way more money is going into sucking the last calorie of fossil fuel out of the tissues of the earth, and the melting of the ice in the Hudson, in the Northwest Passage, the melting of ice in the Hudson Bay is a big part of this. What we have here is Greenpeace going against a Russian oil rig in the Russian areas of the Arctic. The international competition in the northern seas is astonishing. The military competition, the corporate competition, the sucking of the last calorie of carbon out of this planet is a big deal. So we get to the Holocene. Now, my figure over here is Potnia theron, or Medusa. Medusa is the Greek version of this snake-haired phonic entity who is Potnia theron, Potnia Melissa, the goddess of the bees, who is a very old and phonic figure who is in no one's pocket, a figure of creation and destruction, an entity of extraordinary powers. And I would suggest to you that those who think the phonic ones are old, traditional, done, been there, supplanted by civilization, are simply wrong. I figure that for this purpose with the Ood out of Doctor Who, science fiction film TV series that I bet everybody in the room has at least seen some of. And I remind you that the tentacular ones, whose faces are tentacles, not eyes, whose faces are feelers, that the Ood had their hindbrain outside their body, and that the bad enslavers came and cut their hindbrain, which was the part of them that tied them to each other into the possibility of what they called a hive mind, but let's just call it community, or thinking with each other, and replaced it with a little glowing globe that could be controlled by the slave makers. So I think of the Ood as a perfectly appropriate phonic one for the Holocene.
Are you an animal or a person?
Fine animal gorilla.
Now I can change a man into a gorilla. A man to a gorilla.
Are you an animal or a person?
Fine animal gorilla.
The words we just heard were spoken by the gorilla Coco to the human being Penny Patterson. Let's look at those words from the point of view of the way a world looks to a culture critic. And let's take culture apart like these balls of yarn. First, I'd like to explain the principle that I use in looking at the production of modern culture. It seems to me the cultural critic is faced by a world that looks very much like tangled balls of yarn. And that one way to approach the situation is to pull on a thread and begin to untangle the ball of meanings and begin to trace through one thread and then another what gets to count as nature, for whom and when, and how much it costs to produce nature at a particular moment in history for a particular group of people. What gets to count as nature, for whom and when, and how much it costs to produce nature at a particular moment in history for a particular group of people, 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 for a particular group of people. And another way to imagine the same situation is to take a layer cake, Pepperidge Farm layer cake, formerly boycotted because of the Nestle bottle feeding scandal, to take a layer cake and cut into history as if it were a layer cake and begin to unpack the layers of meanings. Okay. And let's go to a strange mythic space called the wilds of Tanzania, and let's go there with the National Geographic magazine. Here we are in the wilds of Tanzania, brought there by the National Geographic magazine, and the National Geographic television specials. But despite the fact that I know how to load my magazine now, we're going to go to the wilds of Tanzania unarmed. But the question we have to ask in the wilds of Tanzania is, what exactly does it cost to put a white, virgin, blonde woman in this strange, sacred place called the wilds of Tanzania in 1960? What does it cost to be alone in nature the year that the Belgian Congo becomes the Republic of the Congo, and Jane Goodall on her way to the scenes of intimacy with the wild chimpanzees in the Gombe Stream Preserve, the scenes of intimacy that have become part of television life, part of the touch with nature from the first world to the third world? What does it cost to be alone in nature as Jane Goodall and her mother stop on the shores of the lake before taking the boat to the Gombe Stream and make 2,000 Spam sandwiches for fleeing Belgians the year of the independence of the Republic of the Congo?
For most, This would be a lonely, forbidding realm. But for Jane Goodall, it was where she most wanted to be.
During my first days at Gombe, I could hardly believe it was true. At last, I was out in the wild.
Understanding is everything. The Sun and Earth logo of the Gulf Corporation, one of the Seven Sisters, of course, and I like to think of this particular unraveling and cultural commentary on what gets to count as nature as the nature of gender for the Seven Sisters. One of the Seven Sisters, the Gulf Oil Corporation, is bringing us Jane Goodall alone in this extraordinary space called the wilds of Tanzania. Well, when can woman best represent man is one of the first questions we have here. What we have in this advertisement is the leathery hand of the animal reaching in and initiating touch from the region of nature. The animal initiates touch as the white, virgin human hand reaches in to receive the touch of the animal at precisely the historical moment that white man is expelled from the wilds of Tanzania, from the heart of Africa, at precisely the moment that white man is no longer welcome as the colonizers in Africa. Race, recoded onto the animal, reaches out and touches a woman who is coded as scientist, but coded as Dr. Goodall only after she's first coded as Jane. The animal reaches out, touch is established, and the woman exits from the touch as Dr. Goodall. Then we see Jane Goodall on the top of a mountain, a young virgin white woman coded as self-sufficient, a very strange state in a regime of compulsory heterosexuality, a very strange state to code a young virgin woman as self-sufficient and complete unto herself. We see her on the top of a mountain, waiting for dawn's first light, waiting to see the chimpanzees across the chasm on the other side of the valley. We see her pulling a blanket around herself. We hear voiceover, Jane Goodall's voiceover about her self-sufficiency, about her loneliness, about her seeking this pure touch with nature. And all of a sudden, there's a tiny little intervening sign in the picture that disrupts the entire thing. The tiny little thread that we pull apart is a can of pork and beans. Jane Goodall is eating a can of pork and beans, alone on the mountain. Now, anyone who has even heard of the Civil War will remember how armor made his fortunes, how the canning industries grew out of the Civil War, how the history of industrial capitalism, how the history of the canning industry, the history of standardization in war, the history of the possibility of sustaining the particular penetration into nature that the breakup of the African continent by the European colonial powers in the 19th century, that's what's coded into that can of pork and beans that sustains Jane Goodall on her mountain late at night while she's waiting for first sight of the animals who will come to her in the morning. The question that confronts us as we leave the wilds of Tanzania and the extraterrestrial and mythic regions of space, the Silicon Valley and the Los Altos Hills, the question confronts us of what oppositional politics look like. And the first principle that it seems to me we have to learn is that reversal won't work. The card at first struck me as extremely funny and a perfect reversal of the King Kong story. I saw the broken shackle on the Marilyn Monroe figure and understood that this was a women's lib figure who had broken spectacle and had entered the space of desire, but that her desire was taking place in the closed space of the bedroom, and that in this picture, the instruments of late capitalism were not going to be called in to resolve the sexual and racial politics between King Kong and the blonde virgin. The cruise missile won't enter this bedroom as the airplane shot Kong off of that symbol of monopoly capital, the Empire State Building. The silverback gorilla is pulling the blanket up, pursing his lips in a kind of fear and astonishment. And the King Kong figure very quickly comes across to us as a feminized black man, indeed as a black queen, and the tones of homophobia begin to emerge from the image of the Hallmark card. So that what I think we end up saying with this kind of object lesson that reversals don't work is that our oppositional politics are indeed to recode nature and culture, but our recodings are going to have to be unwindings and rewindings and decodings and recodings that again and again and again make clear to us the contradictions of race, sex, and class in what gets to count as nature, for whom, and at what price.
Think we must. Well, Sarah already introduced me with Think We Must, so I'm going to share what I brought. It seemed to me that one of the ways to present or introduce or preface Donna Haraway would just be to talk about some of the figures she uses to think with, to let you hear some of her language, written language, as I speak it out to you. I did not myself study with Donna Haraway, but as I was talking with Julie Rousseau the other day, generations and generations of us that are now teachers are people who encountered her work in the classroom and were inspired and moved by it to end up doing what we're doing. So there's something, a particular place you end up in when, as a teacher, you teach or present on something that you yourself were taught or encountered as a student. And definitely, for folks of my generation, we had a kind of running joke that in every college class you read Donna Haraway, and this wasn't something we resented. It was just exciting. It was something that we were attracted to, and that got better every time we read it. So the first thing I think you will notice, we asked you to read some short pieces by Harroway. The first thing you will notice as you begin to look deeper into her work is her use of language. In a recent interview, she said the following: "Every act of syntax is also a kind of fierce joke on our desire to classify, to control, to know, to identify. But by the time you reach the end of a sentence, you've said at least 6 things that aren't true, and you don't hold. But to get to the end of the sentence, you don't have any choice. You can't simply say what you mean. That's not how language works." Her initial shorthand for this attitude was irony, but I think in her more recent work, it is something that's manifest simply in the accumulation of these thinking figures. And there's different orders of figures. So we were talking about how Culp presented with Gaia, Prometheus, and Medea, or at least that's how he concluded and summed up his thinking. We already could say, what about Medusa? Yeah, and you see how that's different than intervening and saying, do we like or not like Culp's figures? This is something which simply is additive, and that is generally, I think, the sort of mode that Donna Haraway presents in. So let me talk about some of these figures. Because in the same way that it matters what stories tell stories, it matters what figures figure figures. The two I'll start with are cat's cradle and companion species, which I link with the process of queering. Maybe even the figure of the queer, if the queer can be a figure, as when Harroway talks about queer kinship, or Mckenzie Wark talks about queer orphans. In an article from 1994 called "A Game of Cat's Cradle," science studies, feminist theory, and cultural studies, Harroway writes a kind of methodology about how to bring these three areas, science studies, feminist theory, and cultural studies, together in the figure of Cat's Cradle. So let's think about this. It is a figure in more than one sense. Yeah, I mean, in the game of Cat's Cradle, you are literally making a figure with string. But then that capacity to make a figure, which begins with one loop, the game is played in making the single loop complex to get to an increasingly entangled, but still somewhat ordered figure. But it is still in our hands. It is still, in that sense, at the scale of something we can manipulate and play with and think through. And importantly, you can also play this with others. So it is not a game that is simply for oneself. She writes in that article from 1994, "I seek a knotted analytical practice, one that gets tangled up among these three internally non-homogeneous, non-exclusive, often mutually constitutive, but also non-isomorphic and sometimes mutually repellent webs of discourse." Again, the science studies, the feminist theory, and the cultural studies. And she also says, Cat's Cradle is a game about patterns or knots. It takes great skill and can result in serious surprises. One person can build up a large repertoire of string figures on a single pair of hands. But the Cat's Cradle figures can be passed back and forth on the hands of several players who add new moves in the building of complex patterns. Cat's Cradle invites a sense of collective work, of one person not being able to make all the patterns alone. One does not win at Cat's Cradle. The goal is more interesting and open-ended than that. As we tease out this description, one of the things that I notice is that what's being offered here is an alternative to what we call critique, is in a certain sense reminding us that the sorts of games we play without knowing they're games, we forget that they're games, the game like critique, for example, have alternatives. And the alternatives are, Harroway often points out, right before us, with us in the games we play, or simple activities which turn out not to be so simple. The larger stakes for this, she says still in this article from 1994, is to queer what counts as nature. She says, queering what counts as nature is my categorical imperative. And this is not simply for the easy effect of transgression, but for the hope of livable worlds. So one answer to what are all these thinking figures for is to queer nature, to undo, among other things, the dichotomy or the dualism between the real and the constructed. And this is why, as you heard Sarah say, in her more recent writing, Harroway uses the single compound word, nature culture. Similarly, the figure of companion species results from a noticing in her work, The Companion Species Manifesto, which was published in 2003. She writes at length about the species that are with us, the species that we are to other species, and her primary example is her dog Cayenne. So she writes, I propose the term companion species instead of human/non-human, or humanism in its various prefixes, and again refers to queering. Queering has the job of undoing normal categories, and none is more critical than the human/non-human sorting operation. This is where she connects to Le Guin. The two pieces we asked you all to read are precisely about this shift of perspective that happens when we learn to look at things from the perspective of another species.
So Alejandro, interjection here. in both audiences, in both rooms, and for those of you in the ET, my teaching colleague Steve is there. So questions, he's ready to answer them. We have somebody there and somebody here who has geoduck skins, and they're going to be circulated. They've been washed. They're clean, depending on your notion of clean, of course. They can be blown up. They can simply be touched. And so Roken, I believe you're in the ET, and I think Connor and Armando and Aurora, a few folks are in here. If you'd start circulating those geoduck skins so people can have a touch. Our companion species here at Evergreen. Yeah.
Okay. So while that is happening, I have more figures to talk about. This is, for me, an opportunity to just let some of this language wash over you. You know, I think there is one version which is getting used to how Harroway thinks and what type of talk this is. And then, of course, there's books upon books, articles upon articles, nowadays videos upon videos. You can go very deep into her work, and I invite you to do that. For a lot of people, what she's best known for is a text called A Cyborg Manifesto, which was subtitled Science, Technology, and Socialist Feminism in the late 20th century. And this text is centered on the figure of the cyborg, by which she means a hybrid of machine and organism, a creature of social reality as well as a creature of fiction. She says about the cyborg, it is our ontology, it gives us our politics. So in this case, this is a figure of subjectivity. It's a figure of a kind of networked collective self. And it's interesting to note that this emerges in terms of a long-standing dialogue she has with socialist feminists, Marxist feminists, women of color feminists around the question of identity, and specifically identities that are formed based on affinity, based on coalitions. In the Cyborg Manifesto, she dialogues with Chela Sandoval, and then later Sandoval, in her text, The Methodology of the Oppressed, responded and engaged back with cyborg. So there is a way in which the notion of cyborg is at once a kind of break with a lot of the conversation that was happening in feminism that was, you could say in shorthand, technophobic or anti-science. And Harroway tried to reorient, inflect technoscience with feminism and vice versa. But at the same time, it is deeply embedded in conversations that were happening and are still happening within feminism. So she talks here, again, more queering, three crucial boundary breakdowns that occur in the manifesto. Breakdown in the boundary between human and animal, between organism and machine, and between the physical and the non-physical. She says, there are great riches for feminists in explicitly embracing the possibilities inherent in the breakdown of clean distinctions between organism and machine, and similar distinctions structuring the Western self. And again, thinking about this question about language and syntax that I began with, she writes, still in the cyborg text, cyborg politics is the struggle for language and the struggle against perfect communication, against the one code that translates all meaning perfectly. This article is tremendously popular, cited everywhere, read everywhere, republished in numerous anthologies. And in some sense, some folks have even said it has sort of managed to overshadow a lot of her work since then. So I thought I would speak to that. There's definitely a way in which the notion of companion species that I mentioned earlier was her proposal to overcome and broaden the space of the Cyborg Manifesto. And to put this briefly, it was simply in that there is a kind of contradiction on the one hand in the notion stated in the Cyborg Manifesto that we are all cyborgs, and its emergence out of a feminist conversation based on coalitional identities or notions of self based on affinity. That is, you can't, on the one hand, talk about notions of groupings that people opt into because they feel affinity, because they feel bonds, or because they construct bonds with others, and at the same time say, we're all in this set, right? And so companion species, I think, is a way to inflect this differently. And here is a line from the Companion Species Manifesto where she recalls and expands her earlier idea. She writes, "I've come to see cyborgs as junior siblings in the much bigger queer family of companion species, in which reproductive biotechnopolitics are generally a surprise, sometimes even a nice surprise. I know that a US middle-aged white woman with a dog playing the sport of agility is no match for the automated warriors, terrorists, and their transgenic kin in the annals of philosophical inquiry. But self-figuration is not my task, transgenics are not the enemy, and contrary to lots of dangerous and unethical projection in the Western world that makes domestic canines into furry children, dogs are not about oneself. They are dogs, a species in obligatory, constitutive, historical, protean relationship with human beings." So a little bit of that, but you see how this notion is inflected there. The companion species is the figure, but you're asked to think about it specifically in respect to Donna Haraway and her dog, which then allows us to think, well, what is my companion species? And we have something less generic and universal maybe than this cyborg notion, although of course the cyborg is still a junior member of the family. Some people may discover that they are cyborgs. Others may discover their companion species, and others' figures are always kind of on the horizon. So I'm going to conclude by sharing 3 instances of more recent work where contemporary writers are picking up on Harroway and, I think, extending some of her ideas and horizons that I personally find interesting and compelling. The first is a text that was circulated on the internet last year called the Xenofeminist Manifesto, authored by the collective that goes by the name Laboria Cubonics. The Xeno with an X of their name stands for alien or alienation. The Xenofeminists say we seize alienation as an impetus to generate new worlds. We are all alienated, but have we ever been otherwise? It is through and not despite our alienated condition that we can free ourselves from the muck of immediacy. Freedom is not a given, and is certainly not given by anything natural. The construction of freedom involves not less but more alienation. Alienation is the labor of freedom's construction. Anyone who's been deemed unnatural in the face of reigning biological norms, anyone who's experienced injustices wrought in the name of the natural order will realize that the glorification of nature has nothing to offer us. The queer and trans among us, the differently abled, as well as those who have suffered discrimination due to pregnancy or duties connected to child rearing. Xenofeminism, they say, is vehemently anti-naturalist. So that's one inflection. I'm not saying this is a direct outgrowth, but this is the type of writing and thinking I think that Harroway made possible. The second example is the work of Paul B. Preciado, who in a book called Testo Junkie, published in 2008 and translated into English in 2013, writes about a sort of, what he calls the auto-guinea pig principle. It's a kind of inflection, I think, of the tentacular Medusa and the Promethean figure. He writes, "The first principle of a trans-feminism movement capable of facing porno-punk modernity, the fact that your body, the body of the multitude, and the pharmacopornographic networks that constitute them are political laboratories, both effects of the process of subjection and control, and potential spaces for political agency and critical resistance to normalization. I am pleading here for an array of politics of physical experimentation and semiotechnology that, in the face of the principle of political representation, which dominates our social life and is at the core of political mass movements, which can be as totalitarian as they are democratic, will be regulated by the principle that I call the principle of the auto-guinea pig. Make yourself, so the opposition between the principle of political representation and the principle of the auto-guinea pig, to experiment on oneself. The last is Mckenzie Wark, who in his book Molecular Red, subtitled Theory from the Anthropocene, it came out last year, and some of you read it with Miranda and I, Speculative Everything, uses Harroway to think through questions relating to how to reconceive a picture for the left in the Anthropocene, although, like Harroway, Wark has objections to the name Anthropocene. Wark says we have basically this alternative we have to try to get out of between capitalist realism, the view that there is no alternative, there is no way out, there is no conceivable horizon past capitalism, as Wark puts it. It is no longer the case that art or literature or the imagination or the body or desire or the human or nature or the absolute or even the communist horizon could be the ethical or cultural or political avatar of the space outside the machine of the military entertainment complex. It has no outside, and it is accelerating. Capitalist realism, or at least the view from within. He says this is more often than not opposed on the left by a romantic point of view that simply tries to go back, tries to find a pre-capitalist time to return to, or a presumably gentler, preferable stage earlier in the history of capitalism that would be more acceptable than the present one. Wark says this current wants a totalizing critique of technology more than of capital that would ground its rejection of techno-modernity on a claim to something prior to or outside of it, being, nature, poetry, the body, the human, communism. But the problem is that the attendant closing of thought to science and technology now plays into climate denial. This is where Wark intersects with Harroway, also people that work closely with Harroway, such as Karen Barad in the 3rd chapter of Molecular Red. He says, to reject technoscience altogether is to reject the means of knowing about metabolic rift. We are cyborgs making a cyborg planet with cyborg weather, a crazed, unstable disingression, whose information and energy systems are out of joint. And so the third path, after capitalist realism, after the romantic left, Wark calls alternative realism, and this is where he enters into significant dialogue with Harroway as someone who is thinking of ways out, or in dialogue with whom we might begin to think of ways out. And the main part I would point to here is that I think it's specifically in the sense that Harroway has both significantly engaged the term Anthropocene, but also done this thing that if you've been listening to what I said should be familiar by now, which is multiplied the figures. So this addition of Capitalocene, plantation scene, and then her own contribution, Cthulhucene, is a way to register for us that what we are trying to do is not to, I don't have the quote right in front of me, but it was something like that one code which would translate all codes, that one spot from which you could see everything, the God trick position. It is not to arrive at that type of knowledge, but to enter into a significant, disruptive sort of conversation. So, I think that I will read maybe one piece from the second piece I asked you to read today. I read a little bit from the companion species one, the one with the 3 titles, Capitalocene, Plantation Scene, Cthulhu Scene, includes this passage. I also insist that we need a name for the dynamic, ongoing, synchronic forces and powers of which people are a part, within which ongoingness is at stake. Maybe, but only maybe, and only with intense commitment and collaborative work and play with other terrans, flourishing for rich multi-species assemblage that include people will be possible. I'm calling all of this the Cthulhu scene, past, present, and to come. So this proliferation, I'll offer you one last word, which arrives for the first time, I think, for her in the Cyborg Manifesto, but is relevant to a lot of this, is heteroglossia, that speaking in many tongues, or speaking with many tentacles, I'm beginning to think today, plural speech, a language where language itself is at stake because you can watch the words being constructed on the page in front of you, or as Sarah was saying, as she speaks. This is also a playful speech, and in some senses it's also street talk. One of the theorists of heteroglossia, Bakhtin, thought of heteroglossia as first and foremost a form of popular speech. And so I think in a characteristically feminist way, Harroway inflects her theorizing with this vibe and rhythm of everyday talk, even though her writing can be incredibly dense. When you tease it apart, like these balls of yarn, you find little scraps of other people's theories, but also little scraps of the way that any of us talk at any moment, or the tones, the irony, the silliness, the proliferation of ideas that happens in an excited, bubbling conversation. I think her text tried to not leave any of this out, not present a sort of finished, polished product. And by showing you the process of thinking that went into them, they also enable you and empower you to be situated in a position of response or expansion. So those are the remarks I wanted to make. I think. What do you want to connect to me with?
I want to connect now and have a little dialogue here, and then open it up for you folks. And we've got one more slide that we'd like to show that will, we hope, move back and forth between discussion and what we want to do with Donna when she's here week 3. So Doctor Who, British television show, hindbrain. Scissors, it doesn't cut. And if you have a chance to watch the whole Donna Haraway Reads the National Geographies of Primates, you'll discover that the National Geographic magazine was remains the number one gift given to newlyweds. Wrap your head around that one. The story of nationalism is important for a newlywed couple. Why and how that might be, I'll let you think about that one. The ood, tentacular faces. A brain, a hindbrain, the dangers of extending oneself. So I'm placing this between us, and the pieces I'm curious about. The original Lovecraft figure of the Cthulhu, who I know you have written about. In fact, you've translated some of Lovecraft's work. What was that figure? And why is Donna both drawn to it and very, very nervous about that creature? And do I have your permission to extend my brain?
I consent to being networked with you. The book I translated is a book by a philosopher from Argentina named Fabián Ludueña. So it's a philosophy book about H.P. Lovecraft. It takes his stories and puts them into conversation with contemporary philosophy. It's called The Disjunction in Being. And I have a pile of copies in my office if anyone would like one. So I'm happy to share. Cthulhu is an evil god in Lovecraft's mythology. It's a tentacular being there's something utterly compelling about Lovecraft's fiction, but the issue that is of concern to Harroway, as I'm sure some of you at least know, is that Lovecraft was an incredibly racist person, and many of his stories evidence this, not implicitly, but very, very explicitly. And so I think that part of this is Harroway's response to the fact that recent writers like Fabian, also probably better known as the philosopher Graham Harman, wrote a book called Weird Realism, which is also about Lovecraft. So people have been talking about him, and I think Harroway is engaged with that and wants to connect, but again, she wants to sort of take her distance. So the way she did this is to retain some ironic reference to the tentacled evil god Cthulhu, but to add a sound, to add the H sound. You probably heard both Sarah and I struggling with it because we're still trying to get used to saying this. But when she writes, as you saw in one of the 2 articles by her we had you all look at today, Holocene, it is the Lovecraft Cthulhu, C-T-H-U-L-H-U. She has added an H, so hers is C-H-T-H-L-U-H-U-C-E-N-E. See the point I was making earlier about heteroglossia? But what does it do? So, well, for one thing, it adds a breath. Instead of saying Cthulhu, I'm saying Cthulhu. It's making a breathier sound there. It connects, as she has noted in several recent interviews, to the idea of earth forces, chthonic forces, and this is spelled from the Greek C-H-T-H-O-N-I-C, chthonic, the earth forces, when she talks about the last quote I read, the dynamic, ongoing, synchronic forces and powers of which people are a part. And she identifies this in several places with a kind of alternate image of the earth, with mud, with slime, with dirt. And the third figure, which is relevant to her, is a long-legged spider that lives in California, I think near where she lives, whose binomial is Paimoa Cthulhu. So whoever named this spider was making a little Lovecraft joke. I guess the long-leggedness reminded them of the tentacles or something. But Harroway's idea then is to sort of wrap all these up in this complex figure, the Holocene, which invokes the earth forces. And here's a little line about that. The ones who become with each other and in and from the slimy mud and brine, entangled temporalities that evade binaries like modern and traditional. She said in that video clip, right, they're not going. So it is a complex, entangled figure, as most of these are once you start unraveling them.
Thank you. Another question, and people get ready, we're turning it over. Her piece that we asked you to read today ends with 2 references, and I think quite cryptic if people haven't had the chance or aren't familiar with Ursula Le Guin. I'd love it if you would give us your take on what those 2 short stories are and how they're useful for Donna's thinking.
I'll say something brief. This is something I was hoping also would just come up with when folks ask questions. For me, they have to do with the idea that the difference in the notion of identity between this statement, we are all cyborgs, we're all networked, we're all connected, and the notion of companion species, which seems to me more perspectival and inflected, right? That I'm not the companion species of every species in the same way, in some kind of unilateral way, and so I have to discover which specific species are my companions, to which species am I a companion. It seems to me that she reads Le Guin as a sort of someone who can educate us in how to perceive from the other species' point of view. When I say which ones are mine, I might have a way to answer. When I ask, to which ones am I a companion, I might need to be able to reverse and shift perspective. And as I understand it, both of those stories are about that. And in some sense, if we were to study them in terms of like what is the narrative conflict or tension in the stories, it's precisely about the fact that we can get it completely wrong. We can be deeply, we can completely misperceive what it is another species wants. But more importantly, we can deeply misperceive the fact that we are companions, because of course companions doesn't just mean to be, as she said about the dogs, it doesn't just mean to be nice, it means to be linked, to be bonded in some way. One can be brutal to one's companions on purpose or accidentally. So I see that as the lessons. I'll tell you something I read this weekend when I was preparing for this, which I didn't put in here, but I thought was fascinating. In a recent interview, the interviewer is asking her about her use of Le Guin, and Harroway says, yes, I basically want to cite Le Guin all the time. She says, you know, in the same way that other people might cite Derrida and Foucault on every page, I want to put Le Guin in that place. And I thought that was a very interesting gesture and thought. They, from what I understand, are now in correspondence and dialogue, so it is not merely a situation of reading each other, but they are, in, I don't know to what degree, talking, maybe collaborating. So that's something, you know, obviously if someone wants to ask her about when she's here, I'd love to hear the answer just as much as you.
Okay, I have one more question that opens it, I hope. And this question has to do with this slide. It's from the most recent talk, and you saw the video where Donna opens by saying the end of the carbon age and the amount of money that's gone in to making this age last as long as possible for as much profit as possible before we see what happens next. And of course, a direct reference to the oil that will be there if we frack for 50 more years, with the question of what will be left of the blasted planet after those 50 years, which will be a question for the younger people in this room. So it's not just playful, but it's not playful, what we're talking about. In this particular image, you see a coral reef, only it's not. Coral reefs around the world, and this goes back to the talks we've heard from both Gerardo and Pauline is here in the front row with as well, about ocean acidification, what's happening to coral reefs, what's happening to life under the ocean. The chthonic is also that which one cannot see, associated often with, think Moby Dick, what's under the surface, what we can't see, what will arise, and what we need, right? The whale hunt was for oil, which at that period in time was the #1 oil used in lamps. So in this image, we see a coral reef, but we don't. Can anyone see what we are actually seeing? Actually, in the sense of what is this coral reef made out of? It is not blown grass. It is not yarn. What kind of garbage? What kind of plastic? For people, we had a wonderful speaker last year who's completed a book called The Autobiography of Plastic, and her conclusion was the autobiography of plastic is the autobiography of all of us. Steve, who I mentioned earlier, is in the other room. His figure, Steve, I wish I could hear you because I always get this wrong. By 2020, there will be more plastic in the ocean than there will be fish in the ocean. So I can hear him in the other room saying, either I got that date wrong or I didn't, but in the near future, there will be more plastic than there is our fish in the ocean. So what you're looking at, it's a form of plastic. It's the plastic left over from photography, from video, from media stuff, which at least historically has been highly toxic. So the very thing that makes National Geographic possible, that makes us seeing the world that we then care about to protect, has, of course, also led to huge amounts of toxicity. The image next to it that Donna pairs this with is from Elizabeth Jolly's work. Elizabeth Jolly is a paleontologist who just died quite recently. Her work, paleontology, old things, right? But she couldn't work where she was working in Malaysia without recognizing a few things. A, that she didn't know the language. B, that she needed to learn some of the language. And once she did, she realized that the school children she was surrounded by had no idea what paleontology was, and they weren't very familiar with the natural world they were around, and it wasn't part of the British colonial curriculum that they had inherited as being part of this legacy of the British Empire and school books and textbooks. So one of Elizabeth Jolly's projects before she died was to both fund and inspire this set of children's books written in Malagasy, the Malagasy language, about real animals that live in Malaysia and told in really good story form. Good stories about real animals, real natural history brought to real people currently alive who might develop a care, appreciation, and thus an ethic of what do we do on this increasingly blasted planet. So a suggestion that we have is in the front of the room, and we're going to open up for questions and answers. In the front of the room are plastic bags. In these plastic bags are gooey duck skins. And in the tradition of our Tacoma campus, where when we hear a guest lecture, instead of going right to questions and answers, on the Tacoma campus, we give back. What we are giving back to you is toxic plastic bags that have gooey duck skins in them. And our invitation is, let's bring back some art activism for Donna so that we have something to gift her in 2 weeks when she finishes the talk which she's planning to give in this very room. I'm wearing a mask that is made out of gooey duck skins. Now, working with gooey duck skins is much harder than one might think. And again, I'm big thank you and reach out to Connor and Aurora who worked on this face, and to Ruth who took the recipe that I got from Connor and Aurora. You need to tan these skins before you work with them because when they dry out, they'll disintegrate in your hands. Now, this is fabulous. I hope everybody's seen. Can someone hold up who might have the gooey duck balloon sculpture? It mostly popped. I'm going to hold that so you can see it. I don't think you got the joy of touching. So a possibility, I think this started out as Rokin's creation. It had a few more tentacles, a few more blow-ups part of it. So they're down here. What can you do with them? How can you work with them? How would you like to work with them? And the requirement is that the plastic bag has to be part of the creation. Okay, I'm going to take us back to the first lecture of Winter Quarter. It was Frederica Bocott, and she talked about the tan oak tree. Anybody want to guess how the tan oak tree is connected with working with gooey duck skins? Bingo. The tan oak tree was used to tan skins. This is a skin. So on the Anthropocene lecture site for week 1 is a recipe for how you collect fir bark and make a tea that you can then soak these gooey duck skins in for 2 days so that putrefaction and disintegration will not happen. Okay, so that recipe is available for all of us for some art activism. So our gift to you is these bags, and we encourage people to come down. And ET, I cannot remember whether we sent some that direction or not. Maybe Steve can send a runner over to know if we should save some for you in this room or if you have some in that room. I think with that,
So we'll invite people to get them as you formulate your questions, and once people are seated back down, we can do the Q&A.
and the mic is
The mic is over
right
there. There's one in the ET. There's a pile here of gooey ducks and a pile here. So if you're moved, and I hope you are, come collect, yes. Careful though.